Okay, so we're talking about percents today. We just looked at the very first question. I forgot to start recording. So we modeled 45% by shading in 45 squares out of 100 on this 100 grid. So this is something everybody should have seen before. It's review stuff, right? We've all done this before. So if we go down and do 75% out of 100, that just means we're going to shade 75 squares. So I'm going to shade 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. So I'm just counting by tens there and shading that across. And then I need 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you can go back and make these darker and color it a little bit nicer than I did. We're just shading this in and reviewing kind of what percent is. Percent means out of 100. That's where the cent part of percent comes from. So when we're shading things, it's out of 100. Okay, so we should be getting pretty close to done with that. Everybody's enjoying their coloring time. All right, so we're going to flip to the inside of the Foldie, and here's where our definition is going to be. A percent is a special ratio. It is a rate per 100. So this is something that we might want to highlight. A percent is a ratio where it's out of 100. There's different ways to say that, but basically you need to know it is out of 100. So it just goes on to explain 28% means 28 out of 100 equal parts. They have 28 over 100 or 7 out of 25. Wait a minute. Where did they get 7 out of 25? They reduced. Priya, tell me what they divided by.
They divided by 4.
They divided by 4. So they took this and they divided by 4, and they took this and divided by 4, and that's how they reduced that fraction. So when we were looking at our fractions and decimals last week, we weren't really worrying too much about reducing these. We are going to practice reducing some of the fractions today. It says in our directions for the next part, we're going to write the percent as a fraction in simplest form. Simplest form means we need to reduce everything, which you guys know how to do. We just have to practice. Okay, so on number 1, when I see 25%, that means 25 out of 100. Now, if I'm going to reduce that, what would be something I could divide by? What do you think?
Wait, 5.
You could divide by 5. So if I divide both of these by 5 to start with, 25 divided by 5 is 5. 100 divided by 5 is 20. Can I go any further? What could I divide by now?
5.
You could divide by 5 again. So divide by 5, and I'll get 1/4 as my final answer. We could have also just divided these by 25, but it's okay. Just keep dividing until you can't divide anymore. Make sure you're dividing the top number and the bottom number by the same thing. And so this would be equivalent. So 25% is 1/4, which you probably already knew. Okay, let's look at the next one. 48%. You start with 48 over 100. What could we divide that by? What do you think? We could start with 2. They're both even numbers. You could start with 2 if that's the one that you see. So 48 divided by 2 is 24. 100 divided by 2 is 50. Can I divide it any more? Can divide by, well, this won't divide by 4, but we could divide by 2 again. So we could have divided by 4 in the beginning since we did 2 and 2, but this is fine. And so 24 divided by 2 is 12, and 50 divided by 2 is 25. Good morning. So 12/25 would be an equivalent fraction. All right, so let's look at the next one. So one of you guys tell me, how do I start number 3? We're writing a fraction equivalent to 30%. Okay, Priya just did a whole lot. Somebody else help me out. Let's see who's awake. Okay, you want to say it louder?
30 over 100.
30 over 100, good. Now when we're reducing fractions, there was an easy thing we did when it ended with zeros. Yes, Shay. So you can cross off this 0 with that 0. It's basically dividing by 10. And then we're going to get 3/10, which doesn't go any further. So when you see 0 on the top, you can cancel out a 0 with a 0. And basically what that means is we were just dividing by 10. But it's just an easy thing to see. If there's a zeros, we just cancel those out. Okay, so number 4 is 50%. We had that on our starter today. What do you think, Shay? 50 over 100. And can anybody, let's just go ahead and cancel these zeros on the end, which gives me 5 out of 10. And then what could we do to that?
Divide by 5.
Divide by 5. Let's raise our hands. Excellent. And so we're going to end up with 1/2. And I'm hoping you guys already knew that 50% was the same thing as a half, but this just gives you a method. Okay, the next one's a little weird. 250%. Is it possible to have 250%?
Yeah, it's an improper fraction.
It is an improper fraction because we're going to put 250 over 100. So give me some tips on reducing this, Shay.
You can
Cross off the zeros on the end, which gives me 25 over 10. What else can we divide by? Go for it. We can divide by 5. Good. And then we get 5 halves. And if we wanted to, we could change that to a mixed number. I'm not going to bother today. Although actually maybe that would help us understand. I'll just go ahead and tell you it's 2.5. So 100% is 1 whole, 200% is 2 wholes, and then a half is left over. But you can still make this into a fraction the exact same way as all of the others. All right, so the last one is 73%, which is 73 over 100. What do you think about that one, Titus? I think it just is like that too, because 73 is a prime number. And so it's exciting. We just need to box it. All right. It's okay. All right, so this little remember box down here, I think is just to remind you that to go from a fraction to, or I'm sorry, from a percent to a fraction. Don't listen to me there. So we're going to start with a percent. To go to a fraction, what you're going to do is put the percent over 100. So like when I had 73%, that number went over 100. And that's basically how you start that. All right, so we're going to do a little going back and forth on the next page. Give you guys a second to write that down if you want to have all of that.
There's still no question.
Yeah, I forgot to go get some. Just hang on to it and maybe I'll send one of you guys to get trash bags.
Oh, I'll go get track bags.
Okay, so if we move to the next section, it says fill in the missing values. We have fractions, decimals, percents. We're going to practice going back and forth between all of those. So it's going to use the stuff we had in our last test a little bit. So if I say 35 over 100, that's 35 hundredths. How do I write that as a decimal? Priya?
0.35.
0.35. And then how do I write that as a percent? Shay? 35%, because it's out of 100, right? So when this is out of 100, that's what percent is. So I just want to point out so that when we go from the decimal to the percent, if I'm going from here to here, we're moving the decimal 2 places to the right. So we're going to write that down. Move decimal 2 places right. Sorry, my decimal's right here. It's 0.35. If I move it 2 places to the right, which is what happens when you multiply by 100, you get 35%. So just practicing and getting in our heads how we go back and forth. Okay, so on the next one, I have the decimal. I have 0.76. How am I going to make that into a fraction? Go for it. Put 76 over 100, and can we reduce that?
We have to.
We have to, so it'll divide by 2 for sure. So let's try that. You're going to have to write kind of small. So 76 divided by 2 is, I'm trying to think, so 70 divided by 2 is 35. It'd be 38 over 50, and I think we can divide by 2 one more
I
time.
don't have any more room.
I know. So then what we should have done was divided by 4 in the beginning. So 38 divided by 2, I think is 19 out of 25. If you have to go into the next box a little bit, it's okay. Do what you have to do.
I just did divide by.
Wait, do we have to reduce it?
Yep, we're reducing them. We know how to do that. It just takes a little bit of time. All right, now if I'm going from the decimal to the percent, remember we're going to move that decimal 2 places to the right, and it's just 76%. Or we could just go off the fact that it's 76 out of 100, which is 76%.
Or you just know it.
Or, yeah, you guys have seen this before. We are reviewing today. We're just kind of making sure that we have this in our heads, how to go back and forth, because it's going to be important for what we're going to do later. Okay, so if I have 32%, let's go over to the fraction. How can I write that as a fraction, Silas? 32 out of 100. And we could divide this by 2, but since we're short on room, let's think really hard. Is there a bigger number we could divide to make this go a little faster?
4.
Let's try 4. So we'll divide this by 4, and we get 8/25, and I think that's it. I think we did it with only one division, which makes it fit in the box a little bit better. All right, so what would be my decimal for this then? If I have 32 hundredths, what do you think? 0.32. So when we're looking at this percent, what we would do is move the decimal 2 places left to go this way. So let's write a note. We move the decimal 2, I'm just going to say 2 left, because this is notes and I know what that means. So the decimal's here in the end of the percent. You go 2 places to the left. These are going to seem like, well, yeah, I don't even need to know this. We're going to get into some decimals that have like decimals in the percent and some different things. So we're just kind of getting ready for that. Okay, so if I have 15 out of 20, and I'm trying to think of that as a decimal, what can I do that we have as a shortcut that changes 20 into 100? What do you think, Titus? Multiply by 5. So I'm going to take this times 5, which is going to give me 100. And then I'm going to take this times 5. So 10 times 5 is 50. 5 times 5 is 25. So that's going to give me 75 hundredths. So then that's going to give me, what is the decimal? Shay? 0.75. And then anybody want to do the percent, Silas? 75%. Okay. I know, I'm probably slowing you guys down. Some of you probably have this whole thing filled out. But I just want to really think about this really hard, because if we will have to go back and forth. And you're in high school, which I know is a couple of years off. This is going to be one of those like things you have to know to do some really, really big problems. If you don't know how to go back and forth, it's going to slow you down quite a bit. So that's why we have to have this mastered in middle school. Okay, so if I have 85%, Who can tell me what that is as a fraction? Go ahead, Shay. 85 hundredths. And I'm looking at that, and I don't know if there's anything besides 5 that goes into both of those. And so 85 divided by 5 might take me a second. 5 goes into 8. One time, then I'm going to have 35. So it's going to be 17. 100 divided by 5 is 20. Did I do that right?
Let's just say
50
yes.
and 35. I'm pretty sure I did. So I was doing long division, but I was trying to keep track of it here since there's not a lot of room. You could also use a calculator a little bit to help you out. All right, so that's my reduced fraction. And then what do I do with 85% or 85 hundredths when I'm writing the decimal? Go for it.
Move the decimal 2 places to the left.
Move it 2 places to the left like that. And that means my decimal's right here in front of the 85. Good. All right, so I'm going to have you guys do these last two as practice problems.